Number 1. Natalee Holloway, Aruba's most haunting mystery. On May 30th, 2005, 18-year-old Natalee Holloway vanished during what should have been the trip of a lifetime, a high school graduation celebration in Aruba with her classmates from Mountain Brook High School in Alabama. The honor student and National Honor Society member had been celebrating with approximately 125 fellow graduates and 7 chaperones at the Holiday Inn Sunsbury Resort, and the trip had been filled with sunshine, beach activities, and the kind of carefree joy that marks the transition from adolescence to adulthood. On her final night on the island, Natalee went to Carlos and Charlie's, a popular nightclub and restaurant in downtown Oranjestad, where she met 3 local young men who would become the focal points of one of the most publicized missing persons cases in American history. Joran van der Sloot, a 17-year-old Dutch honors student at the International School of Aruba, along with brothers Deepak and Satish Kalpoe, aged 21 and 18 respectively, were seen leaving the nightclub with Natalee around 1:30 in the morning. According to the accounts given by the 3 young men, they drove Natalee around the island, stopped at the California Lighthouse on the northwestern tip of Aruba, and then van der Sloot claimed they dropped Natalee off at her hotel around 2 in the morning, where he said he saw her enter the building before they drove away. However, Natalee never made it to her room, never packed her belongings, and never boarded her scheduled flight home the next day. When her classmates and chaperones discovered her absence the following morning and found her passport and packed bags still in her hotel room, immediate alarm bells rang, and what began as a frantic search quickly evolved into an international investigation that would expose the limitations of justice across international boundaries. The Aruban authorities initially treated the disappearance as a potential runaway case, a devastating misjudgment that allowed crucial early hours to slip away without comprehensive searches or immediate questioning of the last known persons to see Natalee alive. Van der Sloot and the Kalpoe brothers were arrested on June 9th, nearly 10 days after Natalee's disappearance, and their stories began to change almost immediately under questioning. Van der Sloot initially maintained the hotel drop-off story, then later admitted he had lied and that he had actually been on the beach with Natalee when she allegedly became unresponsive, and he claimed he panicked and left her there. The Kalpoe brothers' accounts also shifted, with discrepancies emerging about timelines, locations, and what actually transpired that night. Despite these arrests and the intensive media coverage that turned the case into an international spectacle, Aruban authorities released all 3 suspects due to lack of evidence, a decision that devastated the Holloway family and frustrated American law enforcement officials who had traveled to the island to assist. The investigation expanded to include massive volunteer search efforts, with thousands of people combing beaches, caves, and the rugged terrain of the island's northeastern coast. The FBI sent agents to support the investigation, though their role was limited by jurisdictional constraints, and the case highlighted the complex legal challenges that arise when American citizens become victims of crime on foreign soil. Natalee's mother, Beth Holloway, became a fierce advocate for her daughter, arriving in Aruba within hours of learning of the disappearance and remaining on the island for months, personally participating in searches and publicly challenging what she viewed as inadequate investigative efforts by Aruban authorities. The case generated unprecedented media attention, with cable news networks providing daily coverage and the Holloway family appearing on every major news program to keep their daughter's story in the public eye. In the years that followed, van der Sloot gave multiple interviews in which he provided contradictory accounts of what happened, at times suggesting Natalee died accidentally, at other times claiming she was sold into human trafficking, and in some instances reverting to his original story about dropping her at the hotel. In 2009, a Dutch television program recorded van der Sloot in a hidden camera operation in which he confessed to dumping Natalee's body in the ocean after she convulsed and died on the beach, though he later retracted this confession, claiming he had been lying to impress the individual he thought was a friend. The legal complexities of the case were compounded by Aruban law, which differs significantly from American criminal procedure, particularly regarding detention periods, evidence standards, and the ability to prosecute without a body. In 2010, exactly 5 years after Natalee's disappearance, van der Sloot murdered 21-year-old Stephanie Flores Ramirez in Lima, Peru, beating her to death in his hotel room on May 30th, the anniversary of Natalee's vanishing. Peruvian authorities arrested van der Sloot, and he ultimately confessed to Flores's murder, providing detailed accounts of the brutal killing and leading police to evidence that corroborated his involvement. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to 28 years in a Peruvian prison, where he married a Peruvian woman and fathered a child while incarcerated. In 2012, Natalee Holloway was declared legally dead by an Alabama judge at her family's request, though her body has never been recovered and no criminal charges have ever been filed in connection with her disappearance. The case prompted changes in how the State Department handles cases of missing Americans abroad and led to the creation of the Natalee Holloway Resource Center, which provides support for families of missing persons. In 2023, Sloot was temporarily extradited from Peru to the United States to face federal charges of extortion and wire fraud, stemming from his attempt in 2010 to extort $250,000 from Beth Holloway in exchange for revealing the location of Natalee's remains, a scheme in which he provided false information after receiving an initial payment of $25,000. As part of a plea agreement reached in October 2023, Sloot pleaded guilty to the extortion charges and, in exchange for a concurrent sentence to run alongside his Peruvian murder conviction, provided a detailed confession about what happened to Natalee Holloway. According to this confession, given in open court with the Holloway family present, Sloot stated that after leaving the nightclub, he and Natalee went to the beach where she rejected his sexual advances, and in his rage, he brutally beat her to death with a cinder block, crushing her skull, and then disposed of her body in the ocean. While this confession finally provided the Holloway family with answers about their daughter's fate, Sloot cannot be prosecuted for her murder due to the statute of limitations under Aruban law and the fact that murder charges cannot be filed without a body or additional evidence under their legal system. The Natalee Holloway case transformed Aruba's tourism industry, with many American travelers boycotting the island and the destination suffering significant economic consequences as the case remained in headlines for years. The investigation cost the small island nation millions of dollars and created diplomatic tensions between Aruba, the Netherlands, and the United States. Beth Holloway has continued her advocacy work, speaking about safety for young travelers, the challenges of international criminal justice, and the need for better protections for Americans abroad, channeling her grief into preventing other families from experiencing similar tragedies. The case also sparked important conversations about victim blaming, with Natalee initially facing scrutiny in some media coverage for drinking and going out with strangers, highlighting the problematic tendency to question victims' choices rather than focusing solely on perpetrators' criminal actions. Natalee's father, Dave Holloway, has also remained active in seeking answers, funding independent searches and investigations over the years and writing a book about his daughter's case. The Holloway family's 18-year quest for justice illustrates the profound challenges families face when crimes occur across international borders, the limitations of diplomatic and legal systems in addressing such cases, and the devastating reality that even with confessions and knowledge of what occurred, true legal accountability may remain forever out of reach. Sloot remains imprisoned in Peru, where he will serve the remainder of his 28-year sentence before potentially facing additional prison time in the United States, though he will likely be returned to Peru to complete his murder sentence first, meaning he will not face American incarceration until he is in his 50s at the earliest. The paradise island of Aruba, once marketed as one of the safest Caribbean destinations, became synonymous with a family's worst nightmare and a cautionary tale about the vulnerabilities travelers face, even in seemingly secure vacation destinations, forever linking the island's white sand beaches and turquoise waters with the image of a young woman who went there to celebrate her future and instead met a tragic and violent end. Number 2. The Cancun cartel execution of a travel blogger in October 2021. The vibrant resort city of Cancun, Mexico, long marketed as a tropical paradise for American and European tourists, became the scene of a chilling execution that exposed the dark reality lurking beneath the glossy facade of luxury all-inclusive resorts and pristine beaches. Anjali Riot, a 25-year-old travel blogger from Himachal Pradesh, India, was living her dream of exploring the world, documenting her journeys across Instagram and inspiring her followers with breathtaking photographs and stories of cultural immersion. She had arrived in Cancun with her German boyfriend, who has remained unnamed in most reports to protect his privacy, as part of their extended travels through Mexico, and they had spent several days enjoying the famous white sand beaches, swimming in cenotes, and exploring Mayan ruins. On the evening of October 20th, the couple decided to venture outside the heavily secured hotel zone to experience what they believed would be a more authentic slice of Mexican nightlife. Visiting La Malcarita, a bar and restaurant in the downtown area frequented more by locals than tourists. What Anjali and her companion did not know was that they had walked directly into the middle of an active cartel territory dispute, as rival factions of organized crime groups were engaged in an escalating battle for control of drug distribution territories in the region. At approximately 9:30 in the evening, as patrons enjoyed music and drinks on the restaurant's outdoor terrace, gunmen arrived in 2 vehicles and opened fire indiscriminately into the crowd, unleashing a barrage of automatic weapon fire that sent people scrambling for cover and transformed the lively establishment into a scene of carnage within seconds. Anjali was struck multiple times and died almost instantly, while her boyfriend sustained serious injuries but survived the attack. 2 other people were also killed in the shooting, including a German tourist and a Dutch woman, while several Mexican nationals were wounded in the crossfire. The assailants fled the scene immediately, and despite the presence of security cameras and numerous witnesses, the brazenness of the attack in a public space filled with innocent civilians sent shockwaves through Cancun's tourism industry and raised urgent questions about visitor safety in Mexico's most popular tourist destination. Mexican authorities initially downplayed the incident, with some officials controversially suggesting that tourists should avoid venturing outside designated hotel zones, a response that victim advocates criticized as victim blaming and an abdication of the government's responsibility to ensure public safety throughout the city. The investigation revealed that the shooting was connected to an ongoing conflict between the Jalisco New Generation Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel, both powerful criminal organizations fighting for control of the lucrative drug trade and extortion operations in Quintana Roo State, which encompasses Cancun, Playa del Carmen, and Tulum. While tourists had long been considered off-limits in the unwritten rules of cartel violence, with criminal organizations historically recognizing that attacks on foreigners would bring unwanted attention from international law enforcement and devastate the tourism economy that many cartel members indirectly benefited from through money laundering and protection racket operations, the boundaries that once protected vacationers had evidently dissolved as cartel violence intensified and territorial disputes became more desperate. In the weeks following Anjali's murder, Mexican authorities arrested several suspects allegedly connected to the shooting, though questions remained about whether those detained were the actual triggermen or merely low-level operatives offered up to satisfy public pressure for accountability. The Quintana Roo State Prosecutor's Office claimed the attack was a targeted hit against specific individuals at the bar who had connections to rival cartel operations, and that the tourists were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, though this explanation provided little comfort to the victims' families or to the millions of tourists who visited the region annually. Anjali's death sparked international outrage, with the Indian government demanding a thorough investigation and justice for their citizen, while travel advisories were updated by multiple countries warning their citizens about the increased risks of cartel violence in areas previously considered safe. The tragedy highlighted the increasing encroachment of organized crime violence into tourist areas, a phenomenon that had been accelerating since 2017 as cartels expanded their operations to include not just drug trafficking but also human trafficking, extortion of local businesses including hotels and restaurants, and control of street-level drug sales to tourists. In the year following Anjali's murder, Cancun and the surrounding Riviera Maya experienced a significant spike in violent incidents affecting tourists, including the execution-style killing of 2 suspected drug dealers on a beach in front of the Hyatt Ziva Riviera Cancun Resort in November 2021, an incident in which gunmen arrived by jet ski, carried out the killings in broad daylight as shocked tourists watched, and escaped by sea, demonstrating the audacity and sophistication of cartel operations. The Mexican government deployed additional National Guard troops and tourism police to Cancun and other resort areas, implementing security checkpoints and increasing patrols. But critics argued these measures were largely cosmetic and failed to address the root causes of cartel power, including corruption within law enforcement agencies, inadequate judicial systems, and the enormous profits generated by drug trafficking to the United States. For Anjali's family, the loss was incomprehensible, as their daughter had been a careful traveler who researched her destinations, maintained contact with family members throughout her journeys, and had shown no signs of engaging in risky behavior beyond simply wanting to experience local culture outside the sanitized confines of resort compounds. Her Instagram account, filled with joyful photographs from her travels, became a memorial where thousands of followers left tributes and expressed shock that someone so full of life could be killed so senselessly. The case also highlighted the particular vulnerabilities faced by solo travelers and couples exploring developing countries, where security situations can deteriorate rapidly and where the protection mechanisms available to tourists in their home countries simply do not exist. The German government, representing Anjali's boyfriend and the other German victim, also pressed for accountability, though the complexities of the Mexican justice system, combined with the power and reach of cartel organizations, meant that meaningful prosecution of those truly responsible for ordering the attack was unlikely. Travel industry professionals face difficult questions about their responsibility to inform tourists about genuine security risks versus their economic interests in maintaining the perception of Mexico as a safe destination, with some agencies accused of prioritizing profits over transparent risk disclosure. The murder prompted many travel bloggers and influencers to reconsider the messages they were sending about destinations, with some acknowledging they had inadvertently created unrealistic impressions of safety by focusing exclusively on beautiful imagery while omitting discussions of genuine risks. Anjali's death became a rallying point for conversations about the ethics of travel blogging, the responsibility of influencers to provide balanced information, and the ways in which social media can create dangerous misconceptions about the realities of certain destinations. The economic impact on Cancun was significant, with hotel occupancy rates dropping in the immediate aftermath of the shooting and several European tour operators temporarily suspending packages to the region, though the destination's recovery was aided by aggressive marketing campaigns and price discounts that emphasized the rarity of such incidents. However, the shooting was not an isolated incident but rather part of a broader pattern of escalating violence in Mexican tourist zones, with similar attacks occurring in Playa del Carmen, Tulum, and other Riviera Maya destinations, suggesting a fundamental shift in the security landscape rather than an anomalous event. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's hugs not bullets approach to cartel violence, which emphasized addressing root socioeconomic causes rather than direct military confrontation, had failed to stem the tide of violence, with 2021 and 2022 proving to be among the deadliest years in Mexican history for homicides. The case remains technically open, though no one has been successfully prosecuted specifically for Anjali Riot's murder, and the likelihood of justice diminishes with each passing month as witnesses disappear, evidence becomes stale, and public attention moves to other tragedies. For travelers, Anjali's story serves as a sobering reminder that paradise destinations can harbor deadly dangers, that the boundaries between tourist zones and conflict areas can be perilously thin, and that even the most careful and conscious travelers can become victims of violence that has nothing to do with their own choices or behaviors. Her family established a foundation in her memory to support education for underprivileged children in India, channeling their grief into creating positive change and honoring Anjali's spirit of adventure and her desire to make the world a better place. The Cancun Tourism Board implemented new safety protocols and communication systems designed to keep tourists informed of security situations in real time, though critics noted these measures still relied on tourists remaining within designated zones, rather than addressing the underlying security failures. The case exposed the uncomfortable reality that many popular tourist destinations exist in countries with serious security challenges, and that the tourism industry often operates in a carefully constructed bubble that can burst with devastating consequences when visitors venture beyond its boundaries or when violence encroaches into supposedly protected areas. Anjali Riot's murder transformed her from a young woman pursuing her dreams into a symbol of the risks inherent in modern travel, a cautionary tale that forces difficult conversations about where adventure ends and recklessness begins, though many who knew her reject this framing, arguing that she had every right to expect safety in a public restaurant in a major city, and that responsibility rests entirely with the perpetrators and the systems that enable cartel violence to flourish. Number 3. Grace Millane Tinder date murder in New Zealand on December 1, 2018. 21-year-old Grace Millane from Wickford, Essex, England, vanished during what was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime, a year-long solo backpacking journey around the world that had taken her through Peru, Chile, and was currently bringing her through New Zealand as part of her gap year before beginning a career in marketing. The University of Lincoln graduate had been in near-constant communication with her family via WhatsApp and social media, sharing photographs of stunning landscapes, new friends, and the incredible experiences that come with solo travel, and her parents, David and Gillian Millane, had been living vicariously through their daughter's adventures while eagerly awaiting her planned return home for Christmas. Grace had arrived in Auckland on November 20th and had been staying at the Base Backpackers Hostel in the city center, a popular accommodation for young travelers that offered both dormitory-style rooms and private quarters. On the evening of December 1st, which happened to be Grace's 22nd birthday and also the day before what would have been her parents' wedding anniversary, she went on a Tinder date with a man she had matched with on the popular dating application, planning to meet him for drinks at several bars in Auckland's central business district. Grace was seen on CCTV footage at multiple locations throughout the evening, including at the Sky City Casino complex, where she and her date appeared relaxed and engaged in conversation, giving no outward indication of any distress or concern. The last confirmed sighting of Grace alive was at 9:41 p.m. when security cameras captured her and her companion entering the City Life Hotel on Queen Street, where the man had been staying in room 3011. Grace was never seen leaving the building alive. When Grace failed to respond to birthday messages from her family the following day, her father became immediately concerned, as it was completely out of character for his daughter to go silent, particularly on such a significant occasion. David Millane contacted New Zealand police on December 3rd to report Grace missing, and investigators quickly traced her last known movements through CCTV footage, cell phone records, and her Tinder account activity. What they discovered painted a chilling picture of premeditation and calculated disposal of evidence. The man Grace had gone on a date with, whose name was permanently suppressed by New Zealand courts throughout the trial and can only be referred to as the accused or Grace's killer under New Zealand law, which protects the identities of certain defendants, had gone on another Tinder date the very next morning, December 2nd, while Grace's body lay dead in his hotel room. CCTV footage showed him purchasing a large suitcase from a nearby store, returning to his hotel room where he remained for several hours, and then leaving with the suitcase visibly weighted down and difficult to maneuver. Police tracked the defendant's movements as he rented a car and drove approximately 45 minutes west of Auckland into the Waitakere Ranges, a densely forested area with rugged terrain. On December 9th, acting on information gathered from the suspect's digital footprint, and after he had been arrested on December 8th, police located Grace's body buried in a shallow grave in the bush near the Scenic Drive area, her remains concealed in the very suitcase the defendant had purchased the morning after her death. The autopsy revealed that Grace had died from compression to the neck consistent with sustained pressure, and the pathologist determined the cause of death to be strangulation. The accused was charged with murder, and his trial began in November 2019, drawing international media attention and highlighting important conversations about women's safety while traveling, the risks of dating apps, and victim-blaming narratives that too often emerge in cases involving young women. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of the defendant's guilt, including the CCTV footage tracking his movements, the purchase of the suitcase and cleaning supplies, internet searches on his phone for the hottest fire, large bags near me, and disturbingly, Waitakere Ranges, all conducted in the hours after Grace's death. Perhaps most damning were internet searches the defendant had conducted both before and after Grace's murder, including searches for violent pornography and material related to strangulation during sex, suggesting a pattern of dangerous sexual interests. The defense attempted to argue that Grace's death was an accident that occurred during consensual rough sex, a controversial legal strategy that victim advocates criticized as an attempt to blame the victim for her own death and to normalize dangerous sexual practices as an excuse for violence against women. The defense claimed that Grace had encouraged choking during their sexual encounter and that her death was an unintended consequence of consensual activity. But the prosecution effectively dismantled this narrative by demonstrating that the defendant's actions after Grace's death, including the elaborate disposal of her body, the continuation of his normal activities including going on another date, and his lies to police when initially questioned, were not consistent with someone who had experienced a tragic accident but rather with someone who had committed murder and was attempting to conceal his crime. The jury deliberated for approximately 5 hours before returning a unanimous guilty verdict on November 22, 2019. Justice Simon Moore sentenced the defendant to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 17 years, though the judge noted that the defendant could potentially serve much longer depending on parole board assessments of his ongoing risk to public safety. During the sentencing hearing, Grace's mother Jillian delivered a powerful victim impact statement in which she described the devastation the family had experienced, stating that Grace had been taken in the most brutal way and that her death had ripped our family apart. The case sparked significant public discourse in New Zealand about the so-called rough sex defense, with advocacy groups calling for legislative changes to prevent defendants from using consensual sexual activity as justification for causing death or serious harm, arguing that this defense strategy effectively puts victims on trial for their own murders and creates a dangerous precedent that normalizes violence against women in sexual contexts. In response to Grace's case and similar incidents, New Zealand's parliament passed legislation in December 2020 that eliminated the partial defense of consent in cases where death or serious injury occurs during sexual activity, meaning defendants can no longer argue that a victim's consent to certain sexual practices absolves them of criminal responsibility for resulting harm. Grace's father David became a prominent advocate for this legislative change, working tirelessly to ensure his daughter's death would result in meaningful legal reforms that could protect future victims. The case also prompted important discussions about the specific vulnerabilities faced by solo female travelers, particularly those using dating apps in unfamiliar environments where they lack the support networks and local knowledge that might provide protection or assistance in dangerous situations. However, many advocates pushed back against narratives that suggested Grace bore any responsibility for her own death, emphasizing that she had done nothing wrong by going on a date or by trusting someone she had matched with on a dating platform, and that responsibility for her murder rested solely with her killer. The Grace Millane case became one of New Zealand's most high-profile murder trials in recent years, in part because it shattered the country's reputation as one of the world's safest destinations for travelers and challenged the national self-image of New Zealanders as welcoming and trustworthy hosts. The case received extensive coverage in British media, where Grace's story resonated with families across the United Kingdom who had children traveling abroad or contemplating gap years, and it prompted many difficult conversations between parents and children about safety protocols, communication plans, and the inherent risks of solo travel. Tinder and other dating platforms faced criticism for their role in facilitating meetings between strangers without adequate safety features or verification systems, though the companies argued that they could not be held responsible for the criminal actions of individual users and that millions of people safely used their platforms for legitimate dating purposes. In the aftermath of the trial, Grace's family established the Grace Millane Trust to promote safety education for young travelers and to support families affected by violent crime, channeling their profound grief into efforts to prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. The defendant remains imprisoned in New Zealand and has reportedly been a target of violence from other inmates who view crimes against women, particularly visiting tourists, as especially reprehensible even within prison culture. Auckland's backpacker community was deeply affected by the case, with many hostels and tourism operators implementing enhanced safety protocols, including verified identification checks, emergency contact requirements, and safety briefings that specifically address the risks associated with meeting strangers through dating apps. The case highlighted the paradox of modern travel, where social media creates an illusion of constant connection and safety through the ability to document and share every moment, while simultaneously the very tools designed to help people connect, such as dating apps, can facilitate dangerous encounters with predators who exploit the vulnerability and isolation of travelers far from home. Grace's Instagram account, filled with photographs of her adventures and radiating youth, joy, and optimism about the world, became a memorial that thousands visited to leave tributes, with many commenting on the terrible injustice that someone so full of life, so excited about experiencing different cultures, and so beloved by family and friends could have her journey ended so brutally by someone she had trusted enough to spend an evening with. The Millane family's dignity throughout the investigation, trial, and its aftermath, including their decision to remain in New Zealand for the duration of the legal proceedings, despite the immense emotional toll, earned widespread admiration and demonstrated extraordinary strength in the face of unimaginable loss. The case serves as a devastating reminder that even in countries with low crime rates and reputations for safety, predators exist who will exploit the trust and openness of travelers, and that the adventure and growth that come with solo travel must always be balanced with awareness, caution, and safety protocols that can mean the difference between a life-changing journey and a life-ending tragedy. Number 4. The Bahamas jet ski murder. In July 2018, 22-year-old Allison Miller from Connecticut traveled to the Bahamas for what she anticipated would be a luxurious tropical getaway at a private resort, part of a vacation organized by a man she had been dating named Oscar Suarez. The trip was meant to be a romantic escape to paradise, complete with pristine beaches, crystal-clear waters, and the kind of exclusive amenities that wealthy visitors expect when traveling to upscale Bahamian destinations. Allison, a recent college graduate with her entire future ahead of her, had every reason to believe she was embarking on an idyllic vacation with her boyfriend, unaware that she was actually entering a carefully orchestrated death trap. The couple checked into a luxurious beachfront property, and Suarez suggested they rent jet skis to explore the stunning coastal waters, an activity that thousands of tourists safely enjoy in the Bahamas every year. On July 1, 2018, as the couple cruised the turquoise waters on their rented watercraft, Suarez deliberately struck Allison with his jet ski, causing severe head trauma that left her critically injured in the water. Witnesses who were boating in the area later reported seeing what appeared to be an accident, with Suarez seemingly attempting to help Allison, but evidence would later reveal that the collision was no accident at all, but rather a calculated act of murder. Allison was rushed to Princess Margaret Hospital in Nassau, where she underwent emergency surgery for her injuries, but despite the efforts of medical staff, she succumbed to her wounds and was pronounced dead on July 8, 2018, 1 week after the attack. Initially, Bahamian authorities treated the incident as a tragic accident, the kind of unfortunate event that occasionally occurs in water sports, and Suarez was permitted to leave the Bahamas and return to the United States while the investigation continued. However, as detectives examined the circumstances more closely, disturbing details began to emerge that transformed the case from a tragic mishap into a homicide investigation. Investigators discovered that just weeks before the trip, Suarez had dramatically increased the life insurance policy he held on Allison, taking out multiple policies that would pay him approximately $1.8 million in the event of her death, a red flag that immediately suggested a financial motive for murder. Further investigation revealed that Suarez had meticulously researched jet ski accidents, examined statistics on survivability of watercraft collisions, and had even mapped out the specific area where the incident occurred, demonstrating clear premeditation and planning. The insurance policies had been purchased through Suarez's position as an insurance agent, a profession that had given him intimate knowledge of how to structure policies to maximize payouts while avoiding immediate suspicion. Witness statements began to shift as people who had observed the incident came forward with more detailed accounts, some describing how Suarez appeared to deliberately accelerate his jet ski toward Allison rather than attempting to avoid her, and how the angle and force of impact seemed inconsistent with an accidental collision. Bahamian authorities worked in close coordination with the FBI and Connecticut State Police, as the case involved an American citizen killed on foreign soil by another American citizen, creating complex jurisdictional questions about where prosecution should occur and under which legal framework. In November 2018, for months after Allison's death, Oscar Suarez was arrested in Vermont and charged with murder in the United States, despite the crime having occurred in Bahamian waters, because authorities determined they had sufficient evidence to prosecute him under U.S. law given that elements of the conspiracy, including the insurance fraud, had occurred within American jurisdiction. The case presented significant legal challenges, as prosecutors had to prove not only that Suarez had killed Allison but that he had done so with premeditation and for financial gain, transforming what appeared to onlookers as a vacation accident into evidence of cold-blooded murder. Suarez's defense attorneys argued that the incident had been a genuine accident, that the insurance policies were simply prudent financial planning for a couple who had been discussing marriage, and that the prosecution's case relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence and speculation about Suarez's intentions. However, prosecutors presented a compelling timeline of events that demonstrated Suarez's methodical planning, including the sudden and substantial increase in insurance coverage, his internet search history revealing research into fatal accidents and insurance payouts, witness testimony about the nature of the collision, and expert analysis of the jet ski mechanics and angles of impact that contradicted an accidental scenario. The trial also revealed troubling details about Suarez and Allison's relationship, including evidence that Suarez had been financially stressed, facing debts and struggling to maintain his lifestyle, providing additional motive beyond simple greed. Friends and family of Allison testified about her vibrant personality, her excitement about her future career, and her trust in Suarez, painting a picture of a young woman who had been betrayed in the most devastating way possible by someone she loved and trusted. The emotional testimony from Allison's mother, who described learning of her daughter's death while on vacation herself and the nightmare of trying to navigate foreign legal and medical systems while grieving, brought many courtroom observers to tears and highlighted the particular anguish families experience when losing loved ones to violence abroad. In April 2021, after a trial that spanned several weeks and included extensive technical testimony about jet ski operations, insurance fraud schemes, and forensic analysis of Allison's injuries, Oscar Suarez was convicted of second-degree murder and insurance fraud. The jury deliberated for approximately 2 days before reaching their verdict, having been convinced by the prosecution's methodical presentation of evidence that Suarez had indeed planned and executed Allison's murder for financial gain. Judge Kwasi Lindo sentenced Suarez to 50 years in prison, a sentence that reflected both the premeditated nature of the crime and the aggravating factor of having committed murder for insurance money. During the sentencing hearing, prosecutors emphasized that Suarez had shown no remorse, had never admitted his guilt, and had attempted to profit from his victim's death, arguing that he represented a continued danger to society and deserved the maximum sentence allowable under law. The case sent shockwaves through the travel insurance industry, prompting many companies to implement additional safeguards and verification procedures for policies taken out shortly before international travel, particularly when beneficiary designations and coverage amounts changed dramatically in brief periods. The Bahamas Tourism Board faced difficult questions about safety protocols for water sports activities, though they ultimately determined that the crime was not a result of inadequate regulation or oversight of jet ski rentals, but rather a case of deliberate criminal intent that could not have been prevented through industry safety standards. Allison's family filed civil lawsuits against both Suarez and the insurance companies that had issued the policies, arguing that basic due diligence should have flagged the suspicious timing and amounts of coverage, though these cases faced significant legal hurdles and mixed outcomes. The tragedy highlighted vulnerabilities in the travel insurance system, where policies can be purchased quickly online with minimal verification, and where the time between policy activation and a claim can be brief enough to facilitate fraud without triggering automatic reviews. The case also raised awareness about the particular risks faced by people in intimate relationships with partners who have financial motives to harm them, with domestic violence advocates noting that financial stress and insurance fraud represent significant warning signs in potentially dangerous relationships. For the travel industry, the case served as a reminder that vacation destinations, no matter how beautiful or seemingly safe, cannot protect visitors from the people they travel with, and that the most dangerous threat to travelers sometimes comes not from strangers or environmental hazards but from those closest to them. The Bahamian government cooperated fully with American authorities throughout the investigation and prosecution, recognizing that the integrity of their tourism industry depended on demonstrating commitment to justice for victims regardless of nationality and regardless of where prosecution ultimately occurred. The case became a teaching example in insurance fraud courses and criminal justice programs, illustrating how modern forensic accounting, digital evidence analysis, and international law enforcement cooperation can unravel even carefully planned crimes. Suarez's conviction brought some measure of closure to Allison's family, though her mother has spoken publicly about the impossibility of truly moving past such a loss, describing the permanent void left by her daughter's absence and the added trauma of knowing that Allison's death had been planned and executed by someone she had trusted with her life. The jet ski that Suarez used to kill Allison was seized as evidence and eventually destroyed, while the rental company faced no legal liability but implemented additional safety briefings and waiver procedures in the aftermath of the incident. The case prompted some travelers to reconsider the adequacy of their own travel insurance and emergency preparation, with particular attention to ensuring that family members and friends know itineraries, have access to important documents, and maintain regular communication during international trips. The murder of Allison Miller transformed a symbol of vacation luxury and adventure, the jet ski, into an instrument of murder, forever linking the Bahamas in her family's mind not with paradise but with loss, betrayal, and the devastating reality that danger can come from the most unexpected sources. Oscar Suarez remains incarcerated in a U.S. federal prison, where he will spend the majority of his remaining years, and while he maintained his innocence through trial and initial appeals, subsequent appeal attempts have been exhausted, cementing his conviction and sentence. The insurance companies involved ultimately refused to pay out the policies, citing the murder as a criminal act that voided coverage, and those funds were never released to Suarez or any other claimant. Allison's story serves as both a cautionary tale about the sometimes deadly intersection of romance, finances, and opportunity, and as a testament to the dedication of investigators who pursued justice across international boundaries, refusing to allow a murderer to hide behind the facade of a vacation accident or the complexities of cross-border prosecution. Number 5. The Bali suitcase murder of Sheila Von Weismack on August 12, 2014. The St. Regis Bali Resort, one of Indonesia's most exclusive and luxurious beachfront hotels, became the scene of a brutal murder that would expose a deeply disturbed family dynamic and a murder plot that shocked the international community. 62-year-old Sheila Von Weismack, a wealthy socialite from Oak Park, Illinois, had traveled to Bali with her 19-year-old daughter Heather Mack and Heather's boyfriend, 21-year-old Tommy Schaefer, for what was ostensibly a family vacation at the five-star resort known for its impeccable service, stunning oceanfront villas, and the kind of privacy that attracts wealthy clientele. The reality, however, was far darker than a family getaway, as Heather and Tommy had allegedly been planning Sheila's murder for weeks before departing for Indonesia, motivated by a desire to inherit Sheila's considerable wealth and to end what Heather described as years of emotional and physical abuse, though prosecutors would later argue that these abuse claims were fabrications designed to justify premeditated murder for financial gain. Sheila Von Weismack came from substantial wealth, with a trust fund worth approximately $1.5 million, and Heather stood to inherit this fortune upon her mother's death. The relationship between mother and daughter had been tumultuous for years, with documented incidents of violent altercations, including episodes where both Sheila and Heather had been arrested for domestic battery against each other, painting a picture of a profoundly dysfunctional relationship marked by mutual hostility and violence. When Sheila agreed to fund the Bali vacation, she likely did not anticipate that her daughter and boyfriend were planning to use the trip as an opportunity to murder her in a location far from American law enforcement. On the morning of August 12th, hotel guests reported hearing what sounded like a violent altercation coming from the suite where Sheila, Heather, and Tommy were staying. According to the subsequent investigation and confessions, Tommy Schaefer struck Sheila multiple times with a metal fruit bowl found in the hotel room, fracturing her skull and causing fatal injuries, while Heather held down her mother to prevent her from defending herself or escaping. After killing Sheila, the couple attempted to conceal the body by stuffing it into a suitcase, a large silver case that was barely adequate to contain an adult human body. Security camera footage captured the disturbing image of Tommy struggling to load the suitcase, visibly weighted down with Sheila's remains, into a taxi outside the hotel's main entrance. The taxi driver, noticing blood seeping from the suitcase and finding the couple's behavior suspicious and evasive when questioned about the luggage's contents, immediately drove to the Bali police station rather than to the airport as Tommy and Heather had requested. Indonesian police opened the suitcase to discover Sheila's battered body, and Heather Mack and Tommy Schaefer were arrested within hours. The case immediately attracted international media attention, both because of the brutal nature of the crime and because Heather was approximately 2 months pregnant with Schaefer's child at the time of the murder, adding another layer of complexity and tragedy to an already horrifying case. During interrogation, both Heather and Tommy initially blamed each other for Sheila's death, with each claiming the other had been the primary aggressor, but evidence clearly demonstrated that both had participated in the murder. The Indonesian criminal justice system, which differs significantly from American legal procedures, moved relatively quickly toward prosecution. Heather gave birth to a daughter, Stella, in March 2015 while in custody at Karabakan Prison in Dinpain, one of Bali's most notorious detention facilities known for overcrowding and harsh conditions. The image of Heather caring for her newborn daughter while awaiting trial for murdering her own mother created a media sensation and raised complex questions about the rights of incarcerated mothers and the welfare of children born in prison. In April 2015, the trial commenced in an Indonesian court, where prosecutors presented evidence including the security footage, forensic analysis of the crime scene, witness testimony from hotel staff, text messages between Heather and Tommy discussing the murder plot, and the physical evidence of Sheila's body in the suitcase. The defense attempted to argue that years of abuse had driven Heather to participate in her mother's killing, essentially claiming diminished capacity or extreme emotional disturbance, while also suggesting that Tommy had been the primary actor and that Heather's involvement had been coerced. However, the evidence of premeditation, including internet searches about inheritance law and murder methods conducted before the trip, severely undermined these defensive theories. In October 2015, Tommy Schaefer was convicted of murder and sentenced to 18 years in Indonesian prison, while Heather Mack was also convicted but received a lighter sentence of 10 years, potentially influenced by her youth, pregnancy, and claims of maternal abuse, though many observers felt both sentences were remarkably lenient given the premeditated and brutal nature of the crime. The disparity in sentencing sparked debate about gender bias in criminal justice, with some arguing that Heather received preferential treatment because of her status as a young mother, while others contended that Tommy, as the older partner and the one who actually wielded the weapon, deserved the harsher sentence. Throughout their incarceration, both Heather and Tommy have given interviews painting conflicting pictures of the crime, their relationship, and their levels of remorse. Heather was released from Indonesian prison in October 2021 after serving approximately 7 years of her sentence, having received time off for good behavior under Indonesian law. However, rather than being allowed to return to the United States, she was immediately deported and met by FBI agents upon arrival in Chicago, where she was arrested on federal charges of conspiracy to kill a U.S. national abroad and obstruction of justice. The federal indictment alleged that Heather and Tommy had planned Sheila's murder while still in the United States, discussing how to access Sheila's money and making preparations for the crime before traveling to Bali, thus establishing U.S. jurisdiction. Additionally, prosecutors charged that Heather had lied to FBI agents during their investigation in Indonesia, providing false statements about her and Tommy's involvement and the circumstances of her mother's death. In June 2023, Heather Mack pleaded guilty to the federal charges and was sentenced to 26 years in a U.S. federal prison, a sentence that would run consecutive to any remaining Indonesian sentence and effectively ensure she would spend decades behind bars. Tommy Schaefer, who remained incarcerated in Indonesia and was also indicted on the same federal charges, faced the possibility of extradition to the United States to face prosecution after completing his Indonesian sentence. The daughter born to Heather and Tommy in prison, Stella, became the subject of custody battles and ongoing legal proceedings, with Sheila's family, specifically her cousin, seeking to prevent Heather from having parental rights upon any eventual release and arguing that a woman who murdered her own mother could not be trusted to safely raise a child. The case highlighted the complexity of international criminal prosecution, demonstrating how criminals cannot escape justice by committing crimes abroad, as U.S. law enforcement can pursue federal charges for crimes against American citizens overseas when certain jurisdictional elements are met. The St. Regis Bali Resort, while not legally liable for the murder, faced significant reputation damage and had to implement enhanced security protocols and guest safety measures in response to the incident. The case also sparked discussions about warning signs in family relationships, with domestic violence experts noting that the documented history of mutual violence between Sheila and Heather should have been recognized as a red flag indicating a potentially deadly escalation, and questioning whether adequate interventions had been attempted or whether the family's wealth had insulated them from the kind of social services involvement that might have prevented the ultimate tragedy. Sheila von Wiesmack's friends and extended family members described her as a complicated person who had struggled with her daughter's behavioral problems and had attempted various interventions over the years, but who ultimately loved Heather and had continued trying to maintain their relationship despite the conflicts. The financial motive that prosecutors identified as central to the murder plot was complicated by the fact that Sheila's trust fund contained provisions that would have prevented Heather from accessing the full amount until she reached a certain age, meaning that even with her mother dead, Heather would not have immediately received the windfall she had allegedly killed for, suggesting either that the plotters had not fully understood the terms of the trust or that other psychological factors beyond simple greed had motivated the crime. The case became a cautionary tale about family dysfunction, the dangers of unaddressed domestic violence, and the toxic combination of troubled relationships and financial incentives for harm. The image of Sheila's body crammed into a suitcase became one of the most disturbing aspects of the case, symbolizing not just the violence of the murder but the callous disregard for human dignity displayed by the perpetrators in their attempted disposal of the evidence. Indonesian authorities' handling of the case, including allowing Heather to keep her baby in prison and providing somewhat lenient sentences by Western standards, reflected different cultural and legal approaches to criminal justice but also ensured that the case would continue to generate controversy and debate about appropriate punishment for such heinous crimes. The murder of Sheila von Wiesmack transformed a luxury Bali resort into a crime scene and shattered the illusion that wealth, exotic locations, and five-star accommodations provide any protection against violence when the perpetrators are family members traveling together. The case remains a subject of ongoing legal proceedings as Tommy Schaefer's Indonesian sentence approaches completion and questions about his potential extradition and federal prosecution in the United States remain unresolved. For true crime analysts and criminal justice professionals, the Bali suitcase murder represents a textbook case of matricide for financial gain, demonstrating the importance of multinational law enforcement cooperation and the long reach of American justice when U.S. citizens are victims of crimes abroad. Number 6. The Thailand Koh Tao murders. On September 15, 2014, the small Thai island of Koh Tao, known internationally as a diving paradise and backpacker haven in the Gulf of Thailand, became the site of a brutal double murder that would expose serious questions about the Thai justice system, police investigative procedures, and the safety of tourists in Southeast Asian destinations. 23-year-old Hannah Wytheridge from Great Yarmouth, England, and 24-year-old David Miller from Jersey had both been traveling independently through Thailand and staying at the Ocean View Bungalows, a budget accommodation popular with young backpackers. On the evening of September 14th, both Hannah and David were seen at a beach party at AC Bar, one of several establishments along Seri Beach where travelers congregated to enjoy cheap drinks, fire dancing shows, and the casual social atmosphere that makes Thailand's islands so popular with young tourists. Shortly after leaving the bar in the early morning hours of September 15th, both Hannah and David were attacked on the beach near the accommodation area. The discovery of their bodies the next morning sent shockwaves through the island community and eventually around the world. Hannah Wytheridge had been brutally raped and murdered, with severe head trauma from being struck with a garden hoe that was found near the crime scene, while David Miller, who appeared to have tried to defend Hannah or had been attacked for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, also died from severe head injuries and had been left in the shallow water at the edge of the beach. The crime scene was grotesque and indicated extreme violence, and the remote location combined with the time of the attack meant that no witnesses came forward with information about the perpetrators. Thai police immediately came under pressure to solve the case quickly, both to provide justice for the victims' families and to protect Thailand's crucial tourism industry, which generates billions of dollars annually and relies heavily on the perception of Thailand as a safe and welcoming destination for foreign visitors. The investigation that followed would become mired in controversy, allegations of incompetence, suggestions of corruption, and claims that the wrong individuals had been arrested to satisfy political and economic pressures. Initially, police examined several local suspects, including individuals who had been at the beach party and workers at nearby establishments. But within days, the investigation had shifted focus to migrant workers from Myanmar, a frequently marginalized population in Thailand who often face discrimination and have limited legal protections. On October 2nd, approximately 2 weeks after the murders, Thai police arrested 2 Burmese migrant workers, Zaw Lin and Y Phio, both 21 years old, who had been working at a local restaurant on Koh Tao. Police claimed the men had confessed to the crimes, and DNA evidence purportedly linked them to the rape of Hannah Wytheridge. However, almost immediately, questions arose about the validity of these confessions and the integrity of the evidence. Both men claimed through their attorneys that they had been tortured during interrogation, forced to sign confessions written in Thai that they could not read, and threatened with harm if they did not comply with police demands. The defense team pointed to numerous irregularities in the investigation, including allegations that the crime scene had been contaminated within hours of the body's discovery, with tourists and local residents walking through the area before it could be properly secured and forensically examined. Questions emerged about the chain of custody for the DNA evidence, with defense lawyers arguing that the samples had been improperly handled, inadequately documented, and potentially compromised or even fabricated. International forensic experts who reviewed the case expressed serious concerns about the Thai police's methodology, noting that international standards for evidence collection and documentation appeared to have been violated. The trial, which began in July 2015, attracted international media attention and became a cause célèbre for human rights organizations concerned about the treatment of migrant workers in Thailand and the fairness of the Thai judicial system. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the DNA evidence and the initial confessions, while the defense systematically challenged both pillars of the state's case, presenting expert testimony that questioned the scientific validity of the DNA analysis and documenting evidence of coercion in obtaining the confessions. Particularly troubling were allegations that more powerful suspects, including individuals connected to influential families on Koh Tao, had been excluded from serious consideration early in the investigation, with some observers suggesting that police had focused on the Burmese workers because they were vulnerable, disposable scapegoats who could be convicted without risking the wrath of locally powerful interests. The Miller and Wytheridge families presented a united front in supporting the Thai prosecution and expressing confidence in the investigation, though this position was controversial among observers who felt the families were being misled about the quality of evidence against the accused. In December 2015, the Koh Samui Provincial Court found both Zaw Lin and Wai Phyo guilty of murder, rape, and robbery, sentencing them both to death, though this sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. The conviction sparked international outcry, with human rights organizations, legal experts, and thousands of concerned individuals signing petitions and calling for a review of the case based on the serious evidentiary and procedural concerns that had been raised throughout the trial. Appeals were filed, with the defense team continuing to challenge the DNA evidence and arguing that the investigation had been fundamentally flawed from its earliest stages. In March 2017, the appeals court upheld the convictions, and in August 2019, Thailand's Supreme Court also affirmed the guilty verdicts, exhausting the domestic appeal process and cementing the two men's life sentences. However, doubts about their guilt have persisted among significant portions of the international community, with many observers believing that the case represents a miscarriage of justice driven by the pressure to quickly solve a high-profile crime that threatened Thailand's tourism industry. The murders and the controversial investigation that followed had significant impacts on Koh Tao's reputation, with some travelers avoiding the island and others expressing concerns about safety and the reliability of local law enforcement. The case highlighted broader issues about the vulnerability of backpackers in Southeast Asia, where budget accommodations often lack security. Local police may lack the training and resources to conduct sophisticated forensic investigations, and power dynamics between wealthy tourists and impoverished local populations can create complex social tensions. The families of Hannah Wytheridge and David Miller have had to endure not only the devastating loss of their children but also years of public debate about whether justice was truly served, creating additional trauma as they've watched the case become a subject of international controversy, rather than achieving the closure that criminal convictions are meant to provide. In August 2023, in a surprising development, Zaw Lin and Wai Phyo were among thousands of prisoners granted royal pardons by Thailand's King Maha Vajiralongkorn, reducing their sentences and making them eligible for release after serving approximately 10 years. The announcement of their potential release reignited debates about their guilt or innocence, with supporters viewing it as a tacit acknowledgement that their convictions had been unjust, while others argued that royal pardons are granted for various reasons and do not necessarily indicate questions about guilt. The case remains one of Thailand's most controversial criminal investigations, frequently cited in discussions about criminal justice reform, the treatment of migrant workers, and the sometimes problematic relationship between tourism economics and objective law enforcement in destinations heavily dependent on foreign visitors. For travelers, particularly young backpackers drawn to Thailand's islands for their natural beauty, affordable accommodations, and vibrant social scenes, the Koh Tao murders serve as a sobering reminder that paradise destinations can harbor dangers, that crimes can go unsolved or be solved incorrectly, and that the justice systems travelers might rely upon in foreign countries may not meet the standards they expect from their home nations. The tragedy of Hannah Wytheridge and David Miller, two young people who traveled to Thailand seeking adventure and cultural experiences, only to be brutally murdered on a beach that should have been a place of joy and relaxation, underscores the random nature of violence and the reality that even the most idyllic settings offer no guarantees of safety. The questions that continue to surround the investigation and prosecution serve as a reminder of the importance of competent, transparent, and properly resourced criminal investigations, and the devastating consequences when these elements are absent or compromised. Number 7. The murders of Australian tourists in Thailand's full moon party Koh Phangan, Another island in Thailand's Gulf region near Koh Tao has long been famous for its monthly full moon party, an all-night beach celebration that draws thousands of young international travelers for music, dancing, and the kind of hedonistic excess that has made the event legendary in backpacker culture. However, the island has also been the site of numerous suspicious deaths and violent crimes over the years, with several cases involving Australian tourists raising serious questions about safety at these massive, largely unsupervised gatherings where alcohol and drug use are widespread and security is minimal. The deaths have followed disturbing patterns, often involving young travelers found dead in circumstances that local authorities quickly attribute to accidents or drug overdoses, but which families and independent investigators suspect may involve foul play, homicide, or at minimum, criminal negligence. The case of 25-year-old Australian woman Christina Annesley, who died on Koh Phangan in January 2011, exemplifies the troubling pattern of inadequate investigations and questionable conclusions that have characterized many tourist deaths on Thailand's party islands. Christina had been staying at the Hat Rin Beach area, the epicenter of the full moon party scene, and was found dead in her hostel room under circumstances that her family insists were suspicious and inconsistent with the Thai police conclusion of natural causes. Christina's mother fought for years to have her daughter's death properly investigated, arguing that evidence suggested Christina had been sexually assaulted before her death and that the hostel room showed signs of a struggle. But Thai authorities were reluctant to reopen the case or acknowledge that their initial investigation had been inadequate. The family's frustration grew as they encountered bureaucratic obstacles, language barriers, and what they perceived as a fundamental lack of interest from Thai officials in pursuing justice for a foreign victim whose death, if thoroughly investigated, might reveal uncomfortable truths about safety conditions and the prevalence of crimes against tourists. Similar patterns emerged in other Australian tourist deaths on Koh Phangan and nearby islands, including cases where young travelers died from falls that families suspected were not accidental, drownings in shallow water under circumstances that seemed implausible, and drug overdoses that involved substances the victims' families insisted they would never have voluntarily consumed. The Australian government, responding to concerns from families and advocacy groups, issued travel advisories warning citizens about the specific risks associated with full moon parties and similar events, noting the dangers of drink spiking, theft, assault, and inadequate emergency medical services in remote island locations. The travel advisories represented a diplomatic challenge, as Thailand is an important trading partner and tourist destination for Australia, and criticizing the safety of Thai tourist locations or the competence of Thai investigations risked creating tensions between the two nations. However, the mounting number of Australian casualties and the consistent complaints from families about inadequate investigations forced the Australian government to take a more public stance on the issue. In 2016, the case of 23-year-old Australian tourist Luke Miller, who was found dead in a swimming pool at the Sunset Bar on Koh Tao, another party destination, galvanized international attention to the pattern of suspicious tourist deaths in Thailand. Luke's body showed injuries inconsistent with drowning, and his family's independent investigation revealed what they believed was evidence of a violent assault before he entered the water. Thai police concluded that Luke's death was an accidental drowning, possibly alcohol-related, but Luke's family rejected this finding and mounted a campaign for a proper investigation, hiring private investigators and forensic experts who identified what they believed were clear indications of foul play. The family's quest for answers was hampered by the same obstacles that had frustrated other families: lack of cooperation from Thai authorities, inadequate crime scene preservation, missing or poorly documented evidence, and a seeming presumption that any tourist death involving alcohol or occurring at a party venue must be the victim's own fault. The cultural attitude that sometimes blames tourists for their own victimization, suggesting that those who travel to party destinations and consume alcohol have implicitly accepted the risks and consequences of their choices, reflects a problematic approach to victim responsibility that excuses inadequate security, poor oversight, and criminal behavior by focusing blame on victims rather than perpetrators or negligent venue operators. The economic importance of tourism to Thailand, particularly to island destinations like Koh Phangan, Koh Tao, and Koh Samui, creates perverse incentives for local authorities to downplay crimes and attribute deaths to accidents or victim behavior rather than acknowledging security failures or the presence of predators targeting vulnerable tourists. Bar and hostel owners on these islands wield significant local influence through their economic power and employment of local residents, making it politically difficult for police and government officials to pursue investigations that might implicate venue operators in negligence or crimes. The full moon party phenomenon represents a complex intersection of tourism economics, youth culture, and the limitations of law enforcement in managing events that attract enormous crowds with minimal regulation or security infrastructure. The parties generate millions of dollars for the local economy, with visitors paying for accommodations, food, transportation, and various tourist activities, creating strong financial incentives to maintain the event's reputation as safe, fun, and relatively consequence-free experiences. However, the reality is that these massive gatherings in remote locations with limited police presence, no meaningful security screening, widespread drug availability, and thousands of intoxicated young people create ideal conditions for crime, accidents, and tragedies. Drink spiking has been reported as widespread at full moon parties, with travelers frequently reporting experiencing symptoms consistent with having been drugged, followed by theft of valuables, sexual assault, or waking up in dangerous situations with no memory of how they got there. The combination of bucket drinks, which are large containers of alcohol mixed with energy drinks and often containing unknown quantities of spirits, consumed rapidly in a hot climate, with potential adulterants or drugs added either by malicious actors or by vendors seeking to increase intoxication levels and encourage more purchasing, creates severe health risks including alcohol poisoning, dehydration, and dangerous interactions with other substances. The medical facilities on islands like Koh Phangan are not equipped to handle major emergencies, and serious injuries or illnesses require expensive and time-consuming boat or helicopter evacuation to mainland hospitals, delays that can prove fatal in critical situations. Travel insurance companies have increasingly excluded coverage for injuries or deaths occurring at full moon parties or involving alcohol, leaving families to bear the full financial burden of medical evacuations, repatriation of remains, and other costs associated with tragedies abroad. The Australian government's travel advisory specifically warns citizens to avoid full moon parties or to exercise extreme caution if attending, to never leave drinks unattended, to stay with trusted friends, to avoid accepting drinks from strangers, and to understand that help may not be readily available if problems arise. These advisories reflect the accumulated experience of numerous Australian families who have lost loved ones in Thailand and who have shared their stories to warn others about risks that may not be apparent from promotional materials and social media posts that present these events as harmless fun. The pattern of suspicious deaths and inadequate investigations has damaged Thailand's reputation among certain demographics of travelers, particularly families of young adults considering backpacking trips who research safety concerns and discover the disturbing frequency of tourist deaths and the frustrations families face when seeking answers and justice. For many young travelers, however, the warnings and tragic stories are not sufficient to deter attendance at events like the full moon party, as the combination of youth, sense of invulnerability, desire for unique experiences, and peer pressure creates a context where abstract risks seem remote compared to the immediate appeal of the experience. The deaths of Australian tourists in Thailand, whether definitively criminal or simply the result of dangerous conditions and inadequate safety measures, represent a broader crisis in adventure and party tourism, where the marketing of destinations as places of freedom, excess, and escape from normal rules creates environments where tragedies become statistically inevitable. The families of victims have formed support networks and advocacy groups, sharing information about their cases, supporting each other through grief and the frustrating process of trying to navigate foreign legal systems, and working to pressure both Thai authorities and their own governments to demand better investigations and accountability. The Thai government, recognizing the potential damage to its tourism industry from continued negative publicity about tourist deaths, has periodically announced crackdowns on drug sales, enhanced security measures for party events, and commitments to more thorough death investigations. But whether these promises translate into meaningful, sustained change remains questionable. The tragedy is compounded by the reality that many of the deaths were likely preventable through better venue security, prohibition of excessively strong alcohol preparations, adequate medical facilities and emergency response capabilities, better lighting and safety infrastructure, and most importantly, thorough criminal investigations that might deter those who prey on vulnerable tourists. The continuing appeal of full moon parties and similar events, despite their documented dangers, speaks to the powerful draw of transgressive experiences for young travelers and the tourism industry's success in marketing these events as essential backpacking experiences rather than as potentially deadly gatherings. For the families of those who died, Paradise Islands became places of nightmare, where their children's adventures ended in tragedy and where the search for truth and justice seemed to matter less to authorities than protecting tourism revenue and avoiding acknowledgement of systemic safety failures. Number 8. Carla Stefaniak murder in Costa Rica. On November 28, 2018, 36-year-old Carla Stefaniak from Hallandale Beach, Florida, was supposed to return home from a birthday celebration trip to Costa Rica, a vacation she had taken with her sister-in-law to mark her upcoming birthday and enjoy the natural beauty of a country marketed as an eco-tourism paradise. Carla's sister-in-law had departed Costa Rica a day earlier on November 27th, while Carla chose to extend her stay for one additional night at the Airbnb property where they had been lodging near San Jose's airport, planning to do some last-minute souvenir shopping and enjoy a final evening in the tropical climate before returning to Florida. The Airbnb was located in a residential area that, while not in a high-crime zone, was also not in one of the heavily tourist areas with significant security infrastructure. On the evening of November 27th, Carla maintained regular communication with her family via text messages and a FaceTime call, expressing some nervousness about being alone at the property and mentioning that the power had gone out and the security guard who was supposed to be present was acting strangely and making her uncomfortable. Her last message, sent around 7 p.m. local time, stated, "It's pretty sketchy here," a communication that would haunt her family when she subsequently went silent and failed to board her scheduled flight the next morning. When Carla did not arrive in Florida as expected and stopped responding to all attempts to contact her, her family immediately reported her missing to both U.S. and Costa Rican authorities, and the desperate search for answers began. Initially, Costa Rican officials seemed to treat the case with less urgency than Carla's family felt was warranted, and the family took to social media to publicize her disappearance and pressure authorities to intensify their investigation. The Airbnb host and property security guard, 32-year-old Bismarck Espinoza Martinez, became an immediate person of interest after providing conflicting accounts of his interactions with Carla and the timeline of events on the night she disappeared. Espinoza initially claimed he had seen Carla leave the property with her luggage on the morning of November 28th, headed toward the airport in an Uber, but investigators quickly determined this account was false. Security camera footage from the property showed no such departure, and Carla's belongings were still at the Airbnb. On December 3rd, after several days of investigation during which Espinoza's story changed multiple times and his behavior raised increasing suspicion, Costa Rican authorities discovered Carla's body buried in a wooded area approximately 100 meters behind the Airbnb property, partially decomposed and showing signs of violent trauma. The autopsy revealed that Carla had died from a stab wound to the neck and blunt force trauma to her head, indicating a violent struggle and murder. Espinoza was arrested and charged with Carla's murder, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Forensic examination of the Airbnb property revealed that the apartment where Carla had been staying had been extensively cleaned with strong chemicals in an apparent attempt to destroy evidence, but blood evidence was still recovered from multiple locations. Espinoza's own apartment on the property yielded bloody clothing and other evidence linking him to the crime. Cell phone records and witness statements contradicted his claims about his whereabouts and activities on the night of the murder. Perhaps most damning, investigators discovered that Espinoza had conducted internet searches on his phone about how to clean crime scenes and dispose of bodies in the hours after Carla's murder, demonstrating consciousness of guilt and efforts to evade detection. The case sent shockwaves through the Airbnb community and raised urgent questions about the platform's vetting procedures for hosts, the safety protocols in place to protect guests, and the company's responsibility when crimes occur at listed properties. Carla's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Airbnb, arguing that the company had failed to adequately screen Espinoza, who had access to the property as a security guard and maintenance worker, and that inadequate safety measures and oversight had enabled the murder. The lawsuit highlighted that Espinoza had been living on the property despite not being listed as the official host, and that his presence and role had not been adequately disclosed to guests, violating Airbnb's own policies about transparency regarding who would have access to rental properties. Airbnb, while expressing sympathy for Carla's family, argued that it could not be held legally responsible for the criminal actions of individuals, and that hosts were independent contractors rather than employees. The company did implement some enhanced safety measures in response to the case, including a 24-hour safety hotline and commitments to more thorough background checks. Though critics argued these changes were insufficient and came too late for Carla and potentially other victims of crimes at Airbnb properties. The trial of Bismarck Espinosa Martinez began in April 2021, with prosecutors presenting the extensive forensic and circumstantial evidence linking him to Carla's murder. The motive appeared to be sexual assault, though the decomposition of Carla's body and the cleaning of the crime scene made it impossible to definitively confirm sexual assault through physical evidence. Espinosa's defense attorneys attempted to argue that there was insufficient proof of his guilt and that the investigation had been flawed, but the combination of his contradictory statements, the forensic evidence, and his suspicious behavior before and after the murder made these arguments unconvincing. In July 2021, Espinosa was convicted of Carla Stefaniak's murder and sentenced to 16 years in prison, a sentence that Carla's family felt was far too lenient given the brutal nature of the crime and the impact it had on their lives. Under Costa Rican law, however, 16 years represented a substantial sentence, and possibilities for increasing it were limited by sentencing guidelines. The conviction brought some measure of closure to Carla's family, though her mother, sister, and other relatives have spoken about the permanent void left by her death and their frustration with what they view as inadequate punishment for taking a vibrant life. The case had significant implications for the short-term rental industry beyond Airbnb, with platforms like VRBO and HomeAway also facing questions about their safety protocols and responsibilities to guests. The ease with which travelers can book accommodations online, often based primarily on photographs and reviews without any in-person verification or standardized safety inspections, creates vulnerabilities that criminals can exploit. Espinosa had been working at the property for years and had presumably had access to numerous previous guests, raising the terrifying question of whether Carla was his first victim or whether there may have been other incidents that went unreported or were not connected to him. The property owner, who employed Espinosa and listed the residence on Airbnb, also faced legal scrutiny and potential civil liability for the murder, as Carla's family argued that employing someone without adequate background checks and allowing him to have unsupervised access to guests' living spaces constituted negligence. Costa Rica, which markets itself heavily to American tourists as a safe, stable, and welcoming destination with incredible biodiversity and ecotourism opportunities, experienced reputational damage from Carla's murder, with some travelers reconsidering trips or opting for traditional hotels rather than independent accommodations. The Costa Rican Tourism Board and government officials were quick to emphasize that the country remained safe for visitors and that Carla's murder was an isolated incident not representative of typical tourist experiences. Though this messaging rang hollow for many who noted that crimes against tourists, while not ubiquitous, were also not unheard of in the country. Carla's case became a rallying point for advocacy around women's safety while traveling, particularly for solo female travelers who face specific vulnerabilities and are disproportionately targets of sexual violence and other crimes. The fact that Carla had felt uncomfortable enough to message her family about the sketchy situation but had not felt empowered or able to change her accommodations or leave the property highlighted the ways that social conditioning, financial considerations about non-refundable bookings, and not wanting to seem overly cautious or paranoid can lead people to override their instincts even when sensing danger. Travel safety experts used Carla's case to emphasize the importance of trusting intuition, changing plans when feeling unsafe regardless of financial cost, maintaining communication with trusted contacts about concerning situations, and choosing accommodations with established safety records over potentially cheaper but less vetted options. The Stefaniak family channeled their grief into advocacy, speaking publicly about Carla's case, supporting other families of crime victims, and pushing for legislative changes and industry reforms to enhance traveler safety. They established a foundation in Carla's memory to provide resources for families of people who go missing or are victims of crimes abroad, recognizing the unique challenges these families face in navigating foreign legal systems, language barriers, and the complexities of international investigations. Carla's story resonated deeply with the travel community, particularly among young women who had taken similar trips or stayed in similar accommodations and recognized how easily they could have found themselves in the same situation. The ordinariness of Carla's vacation, a short trip to a popular destination to celebrate a birthday, made the tragedy feel particularly close and relatable, reminding travelers that violence can intrude on even the most routine and innocuous trips. The case also highlighted the importance of choosing accommodations with multiple reviews, preference for properties with professional management rather than individual hosts, avoiding isolated locations when traveling alone, and the value of accommodation options that provide secure entry systems and do not allow staff or owners unannounced access to guest spaces. For Airbnb, the case represented a public relations crisis and a legal challenge that prompted operational changes, though whether these changes were sufficient to prevent similar tragedies remained a subject of debate. The murder of Carla Stefaniak transformed a birthday celebration into a family's worst nightmare and served as a stark reminder that the convenience and often lower cost of peer-to-peer accommodation rentals come with trade-offs in terms of safety oversight, vetting procedures, and accountability when things go wrong. Carla's bright spirit, her love of travel and adventure, and the joy she brought to her family were extinguished by someone who had been given access and opportunity through a system that prioritized ease of use and economic efficiency over robust safety protocols. Her memory continues to inspire efforts to make travel safer for all, particularly for women who venture into the world seeking enrichment, connection, and the transformative experiences that make travel so valuable, but who deserve to be able to do so without risking becoming victims of violence. Number 9. The murder of Gabriela Cabrins-Albin in Guatemala. In April 2016, 49-year-old Gabriela Cabrins-Albin, a psychologist and spiritual teacher from New Mexico, traveled to Guatemala for what was meant to be a yoga and spiritual retreat at a lakeside property on Lake Atitlan, one of Guatemala's most beautiful natural attractions surrounded by volcanoes and Mayan villages, a destination increasingly popular with wellness tourists, yoga practitioners, and those seeking spiritual experiences in indigenous cultural contexts. Gabriela, who was passionate about personal growth, meditation, and helping others through her therapeutic practice, had been excited about the retreat and the opportunity to deepen her spiritual practice in a setting renowned for its natural beauty and the presence of various retreat centers and spiritual communities. She arrived at the retreat center, located in the small lakeside town of San Marcos La Laguna, and settled into what she expected would be a week of meditation, yoga, healthy vegetarian meals, and the kind of introspective work that such retreats promise. However, on April 30th, Gabriela was found dead in her room at the retreat center under circumstances that were immediately suspicious and that eventually revealed a brutal murder. The initial reports suggested natural causes or possibly suicide, but Gabriela's family immediately questioned these conclusions, knowing that their loved one had been healthy, happy about the retreat, and had given no indication of mental health struggles or suicidal ideation. As pressure mounted from the family and from international attention to the case, Guatemalan authorities conducted a more thorough investigation and autopsy, which revealed that Gabriela had died from asphyxiation and had sustained injuries consistent with violent assault. The scene in Gabriela's room showed signs of struggle, and the presence of cleaning supplies suggested someone had attempted to sanitize the area, raising obvious questions about who had access to the room and what had transpired in the hours before Gabriela's death was reported. The retreat center owner and staff initially provided vague and inconsistent information about Gabriela's activities and interactions in the days leading up to her death, frustrating investigators and raising suspicions about possible cover-ups or protection of someone connected to the facility. As the investigation developed, attention focused on individuals who had been present at the retreat center, including both staff members and other guests, though the transient nature of retreat center populations, where people come and go frequently and often use only first names or spiritual names rather than legal identities, complicated efforts to identify and locate potential witnesses or suspects. The case highlighted significant challenges in investigating crimes in Guatemala, where limited resources for forensic investigation, corruption within law enforcement agencies, and inadequate coordination between local, regional, and national authorities can severely hamper murder investigations. Additionally, Guatemala's legal system moves slowly, with cases often taking years to reach trial, and conviction rates for homicides are extremely low, meaning that even when suspects are identified, the likelihood of successful prosecution is uncertain. Gabriela's family traveled to Guatemala multiple times to press for answers and to push authorities to thoroughly investigate the case, encountering language barriers, bureaucratic obstacles, and what they perceived as lack of urgency or competence in the official response. The family hired private investigators and engaged with international media to maintain pressure on Guatemalan authorities and to keep Gabriella's case in the public eye. In 2017, approximately 1 year after Gabriella's murder, Guatemalan authorities arrested a suspect, though details about the individual's identity and connection to the retreat center were not widely publicized, and questions remained about the strength of evidence and likelihood of conviction. The arrest brought some hope to Gabriella's family, though their experience with the Guatemalan legal system had taught them to temper expectations and prepare for a long and potentially frustrating path toward any resolution. The case never went to trial in a timely manner, and as of recent reports, the legal status remained unclear, with the case apparently stalled in Guatemala's overburdened and underfunded judicial system. The murder had devastating impacts on San Marcos La Laguna's reputation as a safe haven for spiritual seekers and on the broader wellness tourism industry in Guatemala. Many retreat centers and yoga facilities in the area experienced cancellations and struggled to rebuild trust among potential visitors who had learned of Gabriella's death and questioned whether they would be safe in similar settings. The incident exposed vulnerabilities in the retreat center model, where screening of guests and staff may be minimal, where isolated locations can provide opportunities for crimes without witnesses, and where the spiritual or healing nature of the facilities can create false senses of security and trust that leave visitors vulnerable to exploitation or harm. Guatemala, despite its incredible cultural heritage, natural beauty, and growing tourism industry, has serious crime problems including high rates of violent crime, gang activity, and limited effective law enforcement in many areas, particularly outside major cities. The country's troubled history, including decades of civil war, ongoing poverty, weak institutions, and corruption at various levels of government and law enforcement, creates an environment where justice is often elusive and where criminals may calculate that they can act with impunity. For travelers drawn to Guatemala for its Mayan ruins, volcanic landscapes, colorful markets, and spiritual retreat offerings, Gabriella's case served as a sobering reminder of the serious safety considerations that should inform travel decisions and the importance of thoroughly vetting accommodations and retreat centers. The wellness tourism industry, which has exploded in popularity in recent years with destinations around the world offering yoga retreats, meditation intensives, plant medicine ceremonies, and various spiritual experiences, faces ongoing questions about safety, regulation, and accountability when tragedies occur. Many retreat centers operate with minimal oversight, no standardized safety protocols, and no requirements for background checks on staff or security measures to protect guests, creating an environment where those with malicious intent can potentially gain access to vulnerable individuals. Gabriella's family established a foundation in her memory to support various causes she cared about, including mental health services, spiritual education, and advocacy for crime victims' families, finding some measure of purpose in channeling their grief toward helping others. The case highlights the particular challenges faced by families when loved ones are killed abroad, including the enormous financial costs of traveling to foreign countries multiple times, hiring translators and local attorneys, navigating completely unfamiliar legal systems, and attempting to put pressure on foreign governments while lacking the political leverage or resources that might motivate meaningful action. The U.S. State Department's ability to assist families in such situations is limited by sovereignty concerns and diplomatic protocols, meaning that American families often feel abandoned by their own government when seeking justice for relatives killed overseas. Gabriella's story resonates deeply with the wellness and spiritual communities, where her death forced uncomfortable conversations about safety at retreat centers, the risks of travel to developing countries for spiritual tourism, and the ways that desire for authentic experiences and connection to indigenous cultures must be balanced against realistic assessments of security risks. The fact that someone seeking peace, healing, and spiritual growth died violently in a place marketed as a sanctuary for these purposes represents a profound betrayal of the implicit trust that draws people to such spaces. The Lake Atitlan area continues to attract thousands of tourists annually, including many spiritual seekers and wellness tourists, and while Gabriella's murder was tragic, it has not fundamentally changed the popularity of the destination, though it has prompted some retreat centers to implement enhanced safety measures and more careful screening of guests and staff. The slow pace of justice in Guatemala meant that Gabriella's family spent years in limbo, unable to fully grieve or find closure while the case remained unresolved and while questions about who killed their loved one and why persisted without satisfactory answers. The murder of Gabriella Cabrin's Albin transformed a spiritual retreat into a crime scene and serves as a reminder that even places designed for healing and inner peace cannot guarantee safety when institutional failures, inadequate security, and criminal intent converge, and that travelers must remain vigilant even in settings that promise sanctuary from the dangers and stresses of ordinary life. Number 10. The honeymoon murder of Annie Duani in South Africa on November 13, 2010. 28-year-old Annie Duani, née Hindocha, was murdered during her honeymoon in Cape Town, South Africa, in a crime that would eventually expose a shocking murder-for-hire plot and raise troubling questions about the investigation, prosecution, and ultimate outcome of one of South Africa's most sensational criminal cases. Annie, a Swedish woman of Indian descent who had grown up in Sweden and worked in engineering, had married Shreen Duani, a British businessman of Indian heritage, in a lavish ceremony in Mumbai, India, just 2 weeks before the couple traveled to South Africa for their honeymoon. The newly married couple checked into the 5-star Cape Grace Hotel in Cape Town's Victoria and Alfred waterfront area, one of the city's most secure and tourist-friendly districts, and had spent several days touring the region's famous wine country, visiting Table Mountain, and enjoying the natural beauty of the Cape. On the evening of November 13th, Shreen and Annie ventured into Gugulethu, a township on the outskirts of Cape Town known for high poverty rates and crime levels, an unusual destination for tourists that Shreen later claimed they had visited on the recommendation of a taxi driver who suggested they see the real South Africa beyond the sanitized tourist areas. According to Shreen's initial account, as their taxi traveled through Gugulethu, they were approached by armed men who hijacked the vehicle, forcing the driver and the couple at gunpoint to drive to a different location. Shreen claimed the hijackers eventually ejected him and the taxi driver from the vehicle but kept Annie, driving off with her still in the car. Hours later, Annie's body was discovered in the abandoned taxi in Gugulethu, shot dead with a single gunshot wound to the neck. The immediate response was shock and sympathy, with the case receiving international media coverage as a tragic example of violent crime affecting tourists in South Africa, a country that has struggled with high crime rates including carjacking and violent robberies. However, within days, the investigation took a dramatic turn as South African police began to suspect that the incident was not a random hijacking but rather a staged crime designed to conceal murder. The taxi driver, Zola Tango, was arrested and quickly confessed that he had been paid by Shreen Duani to arrange Annie's murder, recruiting 2 local men to carry out the killing and stage it to appear as a random carjacking gone wrong. According to Tango's confession and testimony, Shreen had approached him days before the murder with a proposition to have his wife killed, offering payment of approximately $15,000, an enormous sum in the context of South African township economics where many residents survive on just a few dollars per day. Tango named the 2 men he had recruited, Zolal Mjini and Mond Mbalambo, and both were quickly arrested. The revelation that Annie's murder had been orchestrated by her husband of just 2 weeks sent shockwaves through international media and focused intense attention on Shreen Duani's background, motivations, and the state of his relationship with Annie. South African prosecutors alleged that Shreen had planned the murder because he wanted to escape his marriage, possibly due to his reported bisexuality or homosexuality, which he had allegedly hidden from Annie and his family for cultural and religious reasons, and that he saw having Annie killed as preferable to divorce, which would bring shame to his family and financial complications. The evidence presented during the trials of the conspirators included testimony from Tango describing his communications with Shreen, phone records showing calls between various parties, and financial records tracking payment flows. Zola Tango pleaded guilty to murder, kidnapping, robbery with aggravating circumstances, and defeating the ends of justice, receiving an 18-year prison sentence in exchange for his cooperation and testimony against the others involved. Zolal Mjini, identified as the triggerman who actually shot Annie, was convicted of murder in November 2012 and sentenced to life imprisonment, though he died in prison from a brain tumor in October 2014 before completing his sentence. Mond Mbalambo also pleaded guilty and received a 25-year sentence for his role in the murder plot. With 3 conspirators convicted and all implicating Shreen Duani as the mastermind, South African prosecutors issued an extradition request to the United Kingdom, where Shreen had returned after the murder and where he was fighting to avoid being sent to South Africa to face trial. The extradition battle lasted nearly 4 years, during which Shreen's legal team argued that he was mentally unfit to stand trial due to post-traumatic stress and depression, and that the South African criminal justice system could not guarantee him a fair trial or safe detention conditions. British courts ultimately ruled that Shreen could be extradited to face trial, and in April 2014, he was sent to South Africa and charged with murder, conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, robbery with aggravating circumstances, and defeating or obstructing the administration of justice. The trial began in October 2014 and immediately became a media circus, with intense public interest in Britain, South Africa, India, and Sweden, where Annie's family resided and mourned. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the testimony of the three convicted conspirators, whose credibility was immediately challenged by the defense given that they had already been convicted and had incentives to shift blame to Shreen to minimize their own responsibility. Shreen's defense team argued that the entire case was built on the testimony of admitted criminals who had fabricated Shreen's involvement to secure lighter sentences, and that there was no physical evidence directly linking Shreen to the murder or the conspiracy. The defense emphasized that police had found no communications between Shreen and any of the conspirators prior to the murder, no financial records showing payment from Shreen to anyone involved, and no witnesses who could corroborate the claim that Shreen had solicited the murder. In a dramatic development in December 2014, after the prosecution had presented its case, the presiding judge, Justice Jeanette Traverso, ruled that the state had failed to present sufficient evidence to sustain the charges against Shreen Duani and acquitted him of all charges, noting that the testimony of the conspirators was contradictory, unreliable, and uncorroborated by independent evidence. The judge's ruling sparked outrage from Annie's family, South African prosecutors, and much of the public, who felt that a wealthy defendant had escaped justice through superior legal representation, and that the case demonstrated inequalities in the criminal justice system where those with resources can avoid conviction even when substantial evidence of guilt exists. Shreen Duani immediately returned to the United Kingdom, released from any criminal liability for Annie's death, though he continued to face severe public suspicion and reputational damage. Annie's family, devastated by the acquittal, spoke publicly about their belief in Shreen's guilt and their frustration with what they viewed as a failed prosecution and a justice system that had let them down. The case raised important questions about the challenges of prosecuting murder-for-hire cases where the alleged mastermind maintains distance from the actual perpetrators and where the primary evidence comes from accomplices who have their own legal interests in providing testimony. The acquittal did not end scrutiny of Shreen Duani, as civil lawsuits and continued media investigations kept the case in public consciousness. Investigative journalists and documentary filmmakers examined the evidence, interviewed people connected to the case, and raised questions about Shreen's sexuality, his relationship with Annie, and whether signs of his planning had been overlooked or inadequately investigated. Some reports suggested that Annie may have discovered information about Shreen's sexual orientation shortly before or during the honeymoon, potentially providing a more immediate motive for the murder, though these claims were never substantiated with direct evidence. The case had significant impacts on South Africa's tourism industry, particularly the honeymoon market, as the horrific nature of the crime and the international coverage created perceptions that South Africa was too dangerous for romantic getaways. Cape Town tourism officials and the South African government worked to emphasize that tourist areas remained safe and that Annie's murder had occurred in a high-crime area that tourists were generally advised to avoid. Though this messaging did little to comfort those who saw the case as evidence of pervasive violence and inadequate protection for visitors, the fact that a taxi driver employed in the tourism industry could be recruited to participate in murdering a tourist also raised questions about vetting procedures for those working in tourism-related services, and the economic desperation that might make such proposals attractive to individuals earning minimal wages. The Duani case illustrated how honeymoons, which should be among the happiest times in a couple's life, can become nightmares when relationships hide dark secrets, when one partner harbors murderous intentions, or when vacation destinations expose travelers to criminal violence. For Annie's family, the acquittal meant living with the permanent belief that their daughter's killer had escaped justice, and that the legal system had failed to hold him accountable, a particularly bitter outcome given that 3 other men had been convicted for their roles in the same crime. The case remains controversial in South Africa, where many legal analysts have debated whether the prosecution was inadequately prepared, whether the judge set too high a standard for conviction, or whether the evidence genuinely was insufficient to prove Shreen's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Shreen Duani has largely disappeared from public life since his acquittal, though occasional tabloid stories and documentaries continue to revisit the case and speculate about what really happened and whether justice was truly served. The murder of Annie Duani transformed a honeymoon in one of the world's most beautiful cities into a tragedy that touched on issues of sexuality, cultural expectations, criminal violence, international justice, and the profound suffering of families left without answers or accountability. The case serves as a reminder that danger can come not from random criminals or environmental hazards but from those closest to us, and that even the most joyous occasions can conceal dark intentions and deadly plans.